Hello and welcome to episode 146 of the Chills of Will podcast. And I feel like something's missing my little microphone here. Okay. Welcome to the Chills of Will podcast. It's a pleasure today to be joined by Jonathan Escoffery. And here's a bit about Jonathan. He's the author of the linked story collection, If I Survive You, a National Book Award nominee, a New York Times Editor's Choice, and an Indie National Bestseller. If I Survive You has been named a best or most anticipated book by Entertainment Weekly, Oprah Daily, Good Morning America Online, Goodreads, BuzzFeed, Vulture, LA Times, Shondaland, Time, The Root, Vanity Fair, Kirkus, The Millions, BET, Quarterly Magazine, Real Simple, and elsewhere. His stories have appeared in the Paris Review, Oprah Daily, Electric Literature, Zizivia, Agni, Pleiades, American Short Fiction, Prairie Schooner, Passages North, and elsewhere. Jonathan has taught creative writing in seminars on the writer's life at Stanford University, the University of Minnesota, the Center for Fiction, Tin House, Writers in Progress, and at Grub Street in Boston, where as former staff, he founded the Boston Writers of Color Group, which currently has more than 2,000 members. He is a 2021 to 2023 Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford University. Ooh, that's a mouthful. Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm glad you made it through that.
Oh man. Well, I mean, so many achievements, so many accomplishments. This the linked story collection is incredible. We'll definitely be talking about that later on. How
Thank
does
you.
it, first of all, good morning, and again, thanks for joining me. It's an honor to have you on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
How has it been in this, like, in the wake, I guess wake has a negative connotation, but in the wake of this
Mhm.
success and awards and Oprah and Good Morning America, like how's it feel?
It feels great. I mean, I think I do have a tendency to feel things when I am imagining them in the future or when I'm looking back on them in the past. So, there's a way in which I'm still too close to all of this to
Okay.
actually know what it all means and know what to do with the emotions, the highs and lows. Sometimes you get a thing, or you have I guess what could be perceived as an accomplishment, a positive thing for the book, and you feel absolutely nothing. And then
Hmm.
sometimes something surprises you and it's like, oh my god, like this is the thing that really
Hmm.
is filling me with a kind of joy, or just I don't know, surprise, elation, and so I'm still sorting all of that out, I think,
Yeah.
for the moment.
I want to know, have you gotten any shout outs from Trick Daddy? You
I'm
reference him
still
in the
waiting
book.
for him to hear from Trick Daddy's book
Okay.
club.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
not yet. Him or
Amber Ree
Luke.
has one. Who's the other one? I'm sorry. Oh, Luke. Okay.
Luke, yeah, Luther Campbell, Uncle Luke, as we call him in
Yes.
Miami.
Okay. Pitbull maybe
No,
next, right?
Mr. 305. Yeah, hopefully one of these guys have to or Trina, any of them.
Yeah. Of course.
Yeah, no. Good love from Books and Books, my
Even better.
hometown bookstore, Mitch Kaplan, and lots of love from Miami, which was, I didn't necessarily bank on it,
Hmm.
but it did come through in a big way, and that feels really wonderful.
That's awesome. Well, I had a chance to talk to Natalie Lima,
Hmm.
right? Robin Piguero, some greats from Miami or from Hialeah, from the area.
Yeah.
And yeah, they've always mentioned books and books, and it's great to obviously the book is very much rooted in place. So I'm going to ask you about that a little bit later, about how much you almost feel like it's a character. But that's great.
Mhm.
That's very cool. Like I said, congratulations on all the achievements. So well received, well deserved, and we'll talk about the book in a bit. I'd love to know how it all kind of started. I mean, were you like a bookish kid? Were you Trelawney? Is that how you pronounce the name, the main character from the collection?
Trelawney.
Trelawney. I
Yeah.
mean, do you have some Trelawney in you? Were you the one, always reading? Were you the one, the sensitive one, in the room? I'd love to know like your relationship with words and language growing up.
Yeah, I definitely have some Trelawney in me, and I was a bookish kid, definitely an introvert.
Mm-hmm.
Um, definitely the one at the kitchen table with my family who wasn't fighting to get a word in.
Okay.
I don't have a big immediate family, but my mom comes from she was one of 11 siblings,
Oh
and
wow.
I think she has always felt that need to
Mm,
argue her way into
mhm,
a conversation, whether it's a conversation of two or four.
mm,
And I think I was the one. My brother very much picked that up from her, and
mm.
will cut cut you off,
Uh,
but not in a bad, like, everyone's cutting each other off, so it's
yeah.
a kind of mutual thing,
There
and
you
I would
go.
just kind of sit there like, but I would observe and I would listen, and especially when my family would talk about these stories that took place in Jamaica before my birth, I would listen very intently and
Mm,
kind of make mental notes. And eventually, when as a kid, I wanted to write, but I never really knew what my subject matter was. And as I
mhm,
got older and I started to realize that this actual family history and lived experience could actually be worthy of putting in a book, because I
mm,
wasn't really seeing it in books otherwise, and I figured, well, this could be my contribution to literature.
mhm,
And so in a sense, listening really paid me back and allowed me to tell these stories.
mm. How about language, with your parents being from Jamaica, if there are any parallels to, like, especially the first story of the collection, it was like, there were people would say about Trelawney's mom, like, what language is she speaking, right? The second
Mhm.
story, the second story, I believe, right, is in the father's
Right.
point of view, is in his voice. What I guess not just about language, but what about Jamaica? What about your parents' history? Um, I guess propelled you forward in your learning, made you maybe more worldly or less worldly than people your own age.
I mean, it's hard to say. I think something that helped me um, figure out how to. I don't know if it's a question of worldliness, but I think a question of being always hyper aware of my position as a kind of, I don't know, like an outsider. Like
Mm,
I was the American born person in my house, the only one.
mm,
Um, and I felt like very much I had these dual cultures, much like Trelawney. I was put in daycares and preschools, from basically from birth.
mm,
And I would come home with my little American accent, and largely it's because I spent most of my time with people who weren't my family.
uh-huh.
I spent all day with these other caretakers, um and my parents would kind of be looking at me like, "Oh, you're kind of strange. Like, you're this little Yankee kid." um, but then outside of my house, I'm growing up in Miami at the time, and as I'm, not a baby anymore, but I'm
Mm,
going to school with these friends, and basically none of my friends had American parents.
right.
If they were born in the U.S. Themselves, so everyone kind of had these stories from wherever, like, back home was,
Mm,
that their parents came from. And but in terms of, it's not like Jamaicans or Anglophone Caribbean people hold any kind of majority in Miami. And
mm,
so there was still kind of this, like, well, a lot of my friends are like, we have this narrative of why our parents left. And sometimes those narratives, they would be really fascinating. But they would take up a lot of space in the room. And I felt like, oh,
mm,
I need to also, like, one, become aware of, like, my own family's narrative, because we also
mm,
come from a place, and I had to, I think that in a way made me a little bit more interested in, well, let me figure out, like, where my family history is coming from,
mm,
and its significance. And um I think it's interesting as a writer, when you grow up in a city where this might be or come off as kind of hyperbolic, but it's like my parents didn't speak in any kind of standard American English, and none of my friends' parents did
mm,
either. And it's weird because it's like you what's wonderful is like you inherit, like I would not say it at all that I'm fluent in Spanish, but like there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of Spanish that's just so familiar to me,
Right,
and
right, right.
it's part of my vocabulary. And then there's the Jamaican patois that's part of my vocabulary, even though I don't typically like speak with much of a Jamaican accent. Um, and there's my, my Haitian friends, and like there's all these languages. And what I would find is that leaving Miami, going to a place like the Midwest, and it's almost like the 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 language, the English language, the way it was used seemed so like kind of different to me in a sense.
Mm.
But I appreciated growing up in a place where I had to kind of familiarize myself with other people's cultures and the way people spoke,
Sure.
the language, like the not just like Haitian Creole or Spanish or Jamaican patois, but the way the children of those immigrants used English,
Hmm.
um, versus my more, I've spent a billion years in universities at this point with all my graduate education, and it's just such a different experience of having to balance these different kinds of English in a sense. And
Mm.
I wanted to bring a little bit of that to the page as well, and value and honor that, and not look at it as any kind of drawback, but think, well, how can we actually deepen and enrich this world that these
Mm.
characters are moving through, um, even beyond their Jamaican household, because that's never really been my experience. That is, as many Jamaicans as I have in my family and my friend communities, um, I've never felt that like homogenous
Mm.
community. I've always been navigating multiple communities at a time,
Mm.
and I think that's part of what the book is about.
Definitely. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Well, there's a lot there. As you got older, or even from the very beginning, what were you reading then? Like, were you into other worlds, since you knew so many worlds? Were you like, let's explore more in science fiction, that kind of thing? Were you reading Jamaican or Caribbean authors? Were you aware that there was a dearth, that representation was for sure limited, as it unfortunately still is today? Like, how did you kind
Mhm.
of navigate just reading? Was it just, hey, this is fun to read, I like it? Or were you kind of thinking deeper, especially as you got older, about like representation in different worlds?
Yeah, I didn't think. I guess I did think about it. So I grew up reading. When I say grew up, what I mean is when I started actually choosing the books that I
Mm.
read, whether I mean, I read so many science fiction books that I would just take out from the library that I honestly couldn't even tell you what the titles were, because I just read them and I really loved them, and then I would, you know, trade them out for
Hmm.
something new. And I could tell you more about the storylines than who wrote them or what the
Right.
titles were. But I was big into books that I bought a lot as a kid were like R.L. Stein books. I
Okay.
was simultaneously reading like Goosebumps, which is kind of for younger readers, than the Fair Street, where
Oh
all these
yeah.
teenagers are getting murdered,
Right.
and you have to figure out, well, who's killing them? Is it a stranger? Is it a classmate? Who is it? I love those books, and I really think those grounded me in plot in a way that
Mm.
I would never trade out that
Mm.
experience of really wanting to have moving storylines, even as we're getting to know these characters and learn about culture and learn about things like exclusion or economic precarity.
Mm.
But uh but yeah, I really love those books. I love the Hardy Boys too.
Yeah.
For a time, I mean, I read like the first 50 books. I had a collection. They're still in a trunk in a closet somewhere in my dad's house. But when it came time to actually start writing these stories, and I was writing from before my teenage years. I still have some of these journals where
Oh.
I'd be trying to write these mysteries, and um I kind of would mirror the way a lot of those protagonists were written, which is to say they didn't really talk much about, like, like sometimes they'd say, oh, like this character was blonde, or this one, this character had I don't know, some kind of red hair or something. I never really thought about like what it meant to actually write like the race of a character, or and it was just so rare that I would read a character who was black for or any race that isn't white. Oftentimes though, the narrators wouldn't necessarily be described as white though, like maybe it was kind of implied in, this way and that way. And not just the protagonist, but like the whole cast, the minor characters,
like
and
a default mode type of thing, right?
Yeah, our default kind of. I mean, it became apparent that all these characters were white, but I'm thinking of when I was reading, the Hardy Boys series, and I haven't looked at one of those books in so many years. I hope not to be misrepresenting my experience of it, but I remember there was an issue, or sorry, one of the books. The Hardy Boys leave their little town in the Northeast, and they go on this adventure to Egypt, and they started describing like brown bodies with such disgust that this is like the 50th book I've read, or because I think maybe that was when I said, let me put these books down, even as like a 13-year-old. And it was kind of that moment where I like that light bulb came on, and I realized, oh, like even though they didn't say those other 200 characters that I read about, it never said like I'm going to date Kelly, and Kelly is a white girl. It just said, she's a beautiful blah blah blah.
Right.
And then we have the brown body that's described as grotesque, and it's like, oh, now I realize like I had like none of those other people who ever came before were brown skinned people. And I started to think about like, well, how am I going to create characters who, like, are they going to look like me? Are they going to be default white characters? Am I going to try to be like slick with it, where, well, I'll say I imagine a black guy, but I'll never say he's black, or like try to get away with something? Will that be, I mean, is that what I have to do if I'm not really reading these other books? And part of the problem is that nobody was really putting these books in front of me, because certainly there's a wonderful tradition where I could have been reading black authors who are writing up either about blackness, or they're writing about other things, but black people were involved in those storylines. And those books, I went to school in Florida. I always say I never want to beat up on Florida, but we read the same, I don't know, this like the same 5 books in high school. We would read them over and over again, over the years. And I think once James Baldwin came into play, and it was Sonny's Blues, and it was like, oh, here's how you might approach race and culture, or just story in general, with black characters. And it wasn't until college that when I was able to actually choose my classes, and then I started to actually see like how one might approach creating characters who look a little bit more like me, or may have had some of the experiences that I wasn't seeing in some of that other literature that might connect to my life. And that was really helpful. It was also helpful to also start reading particularly Latina authors who were writing about their experiences as I guess second generation immigrants in a sense. And that I felt really related a lot to my experience, even though it wasn't like exactly my experience. I could see parallels in my experience as the son of immigrants. And, you know, putting those two things together, like reading a lot of work from the Harlem Renaissance and reading, I don't know, like there's a lot of books. Like you mentioned Hialeah, like reading How to Leave Hialeah by Janine Capot-Crissette. And you know, it's a ton of other books. That those things were really helpful for me to even imagine, like, well, if you haven't seen a character who seems to have had an experience like yours, you can see, like, you can take this from that book, and you can take this from that book, and start like mashing these things together, just to imagine yourself on the page. This is obviously not my memoir, though. This is, you know, it's a fictional book that I've written, but it's still coming from my life, and then wanted to honor, like, the fact that there's a lot of Jamaican Americans in this country, and in South Florida.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, just the idea of imagining yourself on the page is obviously a profound thought. If you had to choose, absolutely had to choose, would you pick James Baldwin's fiction or nonfiction?
Nonfiction.
Okay.
The Fire Next Time, which was one that I think I came to way too late.
Nah, never too late, right?
Well, yeah, better late than never. You know, that just really blew my mind. I think it paints a picture of America that America certainly doesn't want to acknowledge even today. But I think we're kind of getting closer and closer. As long ago as that book was written, I think what we'll acknowledge of ourselves as this country that, you know, has never been perfect and has never been for everybody. I think he, you know, and whatever it is, 160 pages, he paints a picture that feels a lot realer or a lot more accurate in terms of like how I've experienced the world and experienced moving through the US, than anything else I've read.
You know, you're talking about Baldwin. Oh, yeah. I mean, I hope that the Floridians will get to read Baldwin, right? I mean, with all the stuff that's going on about all the books they're banning, and history being, you know, history starting in 1995, and everything's been great since, or, you know, or starting in 1950 when things were great, you know,
or that, yeah, exactly,
you know,
right. And there's that kind of contradiction, right? It's like things were better then, and that's how we want it to be, but we want to skip over, like, why everything was the way it was then.
The why is important, right? The why is really, really important, but a lot of people don't want to get into that.
Yeah.
So, you know, you talk about that. I often ask guests about like a light bulb moment, like when, like, man, you know, now I know I want to be a writer. I can do this. Someone loved my work. Someone important to me. Someone who's just, you know, or I just knew it myself. You gave that, you know, unfortunately it was a, you know, kind of a negative one, but led to positive things. The Hardy Boys, you know, and oh my God, the way they're describing, you know, people in Egypt, etc. But like, so did you have a eureka moment or moments where you're like, I can do this. People like what I write, you know, that kind of thing.
Could we pause for just 1 second?
No
just
problem.
because
Yeah. So I don't know any eureka moments that where you're just like, this is the vocation, this is the job.
Yeah, maybe. I would say you know, it was kind of a small series of handoffs. I had re-enrolled in college in my mid-20s, like 24, 25. And, you know, I got a lot of encouragement for my writing, you know, in my real young days, like elementary school. High school was kind of a mess. I was a terrible student, but I also think I had a lot of terrible teachers, just to be frank. But I had this really wonderful instructor in college who was teaching my ENC 101 like comp class, and I took her again for my 202 class, and she was someone who pulled me aside. And it's not like I didn't know I already wanted to be a writer. Like I was working on this sci-fi novel that never wound up going anywhere. But she pulled me aside and she said, you really need to pursue writing in whichever way, whether it's fiction or otherwise. And she'd asked me, what my major was, and I think I was pretty much undeclared at that point. She was like, "You should do English," and I was like, "What do I do with my English degree?" And I still have that question, but it was kind of the first time I'd received that kind of encouragement in in a really long time, and she was kind of like, "No, like you must do this." And so I I don't think I really knew that I needed that encouragement at the time, but what I did know is that I was enjoying, like, the best thing I had going on in life was those classes, and then I started taking creative writing workshops, and I learned about a competition. I was writing prose, but I was writing a lot of poetry at the time too, and I wound up getting I was a honorable mention, which is kind of like the second place poetry prize, but I uh was invited to come to the ceremony, which there was reading involved. I didn't read that night, but they said your name and they read what the judges had to say about your work. And the judge had written something really beautiful about what I had. I think honestly the judge's description of my poem was probably even like better than my poem in a way. But there was an after reception and everybody was just so um everyone really valued writing in a way that I'd never been surrounded by a bunch of people who really valued it and wanted to make their lives about writing. And that was this was some undergrads, but I think it was mostly graduate students who were in the MFA at what I'm talking about. Where I'm talking about is Florida International University.
Okay.
And the professors were present as well, and everybody was just really welcoming to everyone and welcoming everyone to that conversation. And I thought, well, this is like a really great feeling, and I want to extend this feeling, for as long as I can. So I took more classes, and I think it was the very next year that I won the poetry prize.
Yeah.
And so then I got to read my work, and one of the best nights of my life. It was like really a phenomenal night and experience. And I think around that point, I had really learned what an MFA program was, and the fact that you could get funded at some programs. And so I knew at that point, like that was what I was going to do. And it gave me direction in a way that I had never really had before. And even it was like, even if I don't necessarily know how long term, like how everything is going to, align, I knew I wanted to continue to, I guess, chase that good feeling of, honoring the work in this way and that way. And not so much about like winning awards, but just like surrounding myself with people who value what I value, which is it's not always easy to find. And that was, I was trying to decide, I'm getting more, I guess you could say, like little accolades for the poetry, but when I show up for a poetry class, as much as I would enjoy them, I wouldn't necessarily feel like I had like the grasp of the language to read someone else's poem and then articulate exactly what it is that I'm seeing in it and how it's working. Or even if I did have the language, like I didn't necessarily feel joy in that. But when I show up for my fiction workshops, I felt so much joy being able to express what I was seeing in other people's work. And that was the determinant factor that made me apply for fiction programs instead of instead of poetry, which a lot of people at the time who knew me, they're actually like surprised. They're like, what? But that, worked out.
It worked out for sure. Shout out to the FIU. What's their mascot?
Panthers.
The Panthers. Yeah.
Panthers.
And has the professor you talked about who really guided you, has she had a chance to, to meet, to see you again, or have you guys in contact, or does she know about the new book and everything?
I don't even know. I've tried to keep in touch with her over the years, and it's been kind of spotty. So,
Yeah.
but this latest spottiness I'll put on my side, because I haven't really tried. I'm bad at that kind of thing. I'll thank people all the time, but like not in front of them. But I did, my first fiction professor, John Dufresne, like my first professor who just taught me like my first fiction class that wasn't multi-genre. And I really like to think of him as the person who gave me a foundation in writing fiction. And what I liked about John's teaching, it was very like ground level. Like it wasn't super high theoretical stuff, which I appreciate that stuff too, but it doesn't really mean anything until I have that kind of more grounded education. And he was a really wonderful professor, and he came out and co-hosted the Books and Books event
So cool.
when I was in Miami back in September.
So cool.